Hello, my name is Alfred Bielik, more commonly known as Al Bielik. Original family name is Edward Cameron. I have been involved in the Philadelphia experiment, the Montauk Project, time travel, alien connections at the Montauk Project, and some other projects, all of which have been secret over the years, most of which have never been declassified. I wound up in the 28th century, and this was in the time period of 2749 to 2751 AD. Talk about changes in civilization, society, and everything else. It was drastically changed from what we saw in 2137, as this is now 600 years later. The cities were enormous. The cities were beautiful. They had ground-based cities, much as we have always had them, but they also had something else, floating cities. Floating cities, due to anti-gravity techniques being perfected sufficiently that they could float an entire city, which was perhaps not as large as any of our current cities. It was round, or very nearly round, but it floated on this platform, and they could move the city any place they wanted, remaining floating in the air, 4,000 or 5,000 feet above the ground, perhaps, or a little less, depending on what they wanted. But the size of the city was vertical rather than horizontal, 2,200 stories high. That's about 2.5 miles. The cities could move anywhere on the planet. Basically, they stayed hovering and floating. Or if they didn't like a particular location, they moved somewhere else. There wasn't that much traffic in moving cities, I can assure you, because the world population in that era, the 28th century, was only 500 million, and I was instructed later that that was where they had held it for centuries. There would be no more than approximately 500 million population. Some of the features of this, let's start from the political standpoint. As I learned, all of these cities, whether they're ground-based cities, which the majority were, because they had to do manufacturing, they had to have agriculture and various other things to supply the needs of civilization. But all of them, whether floating or ground-based, were rather interesting in their governmental form. They had essentially no government. There was no government as we know it today. There was no money, there was no banks, there was no political jurisdictions, and it resolved down to what would be best called a city-state structure, where the city is the state. And any other cities from that one are independent and operate in their own independent manner. So that was the major change there. There was no elected government. There was no appointed government. There was no government as we had ever seen it in the past. As I found out, each city was run by an intelligent computer, synthetic intelligence, synthetic consciousness, a highly radioactive crystalline structure. Who built them, I had no idea. Nobody seemed to know, but they've been there for hundreds of years. And this computer ran the entire city. There were guidelines set down, there were law books, but no courts. There were guidelines set down as to how you're to behave, what your parameters were. Within these parameters, anything went. Anything was not considered kosher within this realm, this parameter limit, would be expressed as a yellow zone, a zone that you don't want to go into and you don't want to become involved in that type of behavior. If you got out into that area, you were given an invite for a reprimand to the computer, which there was one in every city, running each city. You would literally be called in for, shall we say, an interview or an audience with the computer, and you would be advised that you had broken the law, but it wasn't considered a felony, it was a misdemeanor. And such. If you were judged guilty, you were sent off to one of the work camps for whatever purpose they did in the work camps. It would be much like today, I presume, where any kind of labor, menial or otherwise, had to be done was done. And that was compulsory. That was not voluntary. If you were called in because you had gone outside the yellow zone into what is called the red zone, which is basically what you would today call a felony offense, you were immediately called in for an interview. You were examined, looked at, talked to, and if the computer at that point thought that you were rehabilitable, that you could learn again to be sociable and within the social bounds of normalcy, you were given one more chance. If the computer decided that you were not capable of fitting into society, you were terminated right then and there. Now, there were other people who didn't feel like they could fit into the society, but had not yet committed any of the so-called offenses. Literally, they were allowed to leave. If the word was, if you don't like it here, go live somewhere else. Go out in the boonies if you want, live as a hermit. We don't care. And many did. I do not know what percentage. I was told that quite a lot of people had left the cities and gone out in the boondocks. Whether they formed communities or not, I never did find out. If you weren't required to work, which no one was required to, other than their social obligation, which was well inculcated into the kids, that you had an obligation to contribute to society, to pay for what you have been using and had inherited, for which no money was involved. A sort of credit system was still functional, but otherwise, except for fairly large credit purchases, if that is the right term, they didn't really keep track of very much. It was considered quite free as long as you were able to make some contributions and nobody overloaded the system with demands. That happened very seldom, that there was an overload of demand for goods or services. So as a result of that, there was very little abuse of the system. Now, in this period of time, talking with many people, making friends, I had a number of questions. Who built this computer system? That was my first and foremost question. Who maintains it? What happens when it breaks down? Very common questions. No common answer, and very much uncommon answers. First question about the cities, who built them, who maintains them, who maintains the computers, was rather hard to answer and get an answer to. No one really knew much about the history of the construction of the city or how it ran, other than the computer, and you couldn't request an interview. You could request to go in and ask questions. The aspect of how these computers communicated with each other was unknown, but it did make, the one I talked with did make a number of interesting statements over a period of time. They had been around for about 250 years in this format and this system. There was no one to do any maintenance. Apparently there was no maintenance as such. If one of them broke down, it was simply replaced. But I wasn't satisfied with some of these answers. I started looking further. Didn't find much for a while. Then all of a sudden I got an invite to come visit with another group, a human group, which I did. And then I found the answers to all of my questions. All of the questions I had in mind, they were able to answer. Number one, who built the computer system? Well, they said they did. And the project was started about 2600 AD, and it was basically an experimental system for the purpose of seeing if they could run an entire civilization by computer, and also provide full socialization, i.e. everything is free, but also in the educational system or process inculcate the idea that people have a moral obligation to do something for the community because the community had supported them, therefore they have to help support others in the community, which did work most of the time. In a smaller community, it works much better than in a larger community. If you get cities of well over 1 million population, it's very difficult to get something like this to work and to be usable on a consistent basis. Well, that was one of the questions I had, and there were a lot of others. I asked about the military aspects. No, there was no more military. Well, how do you defend yourself in case somebody comes along, has a lot of hardware, a lot of munitions, a lot of military clout, and wants to take over a city or the whole planet? How do you prevent this? Or do you? Well, the answer was rather complex, but basically it came down to the fact that they had hidden weapon systems in the cities. Not every installation was a city, but they had all of these installations all over, and they were well concealed. They were not described to me as exactly what they were, but they said they were capable of deflecting and defending a city from an invasion from outer space. And there was no data given as to whether or not there had been any such attempted takeovers in the past. But at that time, we saw nothing resembling any kind of an attack, any kind of a threat. It was very peaceful. It was perhaps because of that peacefulness that people were basically so happy there. It was, you might say, the end result of a long dream about a pure socialist state. They had it, and it seemed to work. There's only one fault with it that I saw, and this is something which I have discerned since I've been back, after many years. You get a city or a group which is purely socialistic, no money. How do you keep that group together? How do you keep the society together? In that case, you're looking at a situation where it's partly by the will of the people, partly by, shall I say, some kind of internal control, and partly because one could say there's little choice. If you don't want to live in the city, you go out in the boonies. If you don't know how to survive by yourself, you stay in the city. Survival skills were not something that was commonly taught in those days because all the technical problems of breakdown of equipment have long since been solved, and the equipments generally were working and continue to work for about 200 years without much maintenance. There was definitely a lot of agriculture on the surface and in the periphery, basically, of some of the surface cities. Some of the agriculture went outside the city limits, outside the periphery of the city, but not a lot. They seemed to produce more than enough food for what they needed, which was good, because there was no problems or threats of food shortages. The idea of a threat to the survival in a civilized society had long since faded, because the people were so well cared for. But the herein is also a problem. These people were well cared for by a socialist system. They didn't have to work to do anything, even though they were expected to work and expected to contribute to society. It was not demanded. The things I saw in this society and civilization were at first unique to me. During that 2-year period, I met somebody who became a very close companion. He happened to be a tour guide, because there were a lot of tours in those days, and tour guides, of course, were necessary to take people around and show them the sights and show them some of the old cities. New York City was a museum, if you will, as were some other of the old cities from the 20th century, those that survived. And they made very nice museums out of them. New York was sort of the model to show how people lived in the 20th century. A great deal of it, I did go on that tour, a great deal of it was still intact, most of Manhattan, not all of it. Brooklyn and Queens were essentially destroyed, and they didn't make any attempt to rebuild it because the destruction was too heavy. But the concrete and steel of New York, of Manhattan, and some of the other buildings adjacent to Manhattan survived, and what little damage there was repaired, and they made a very nice museum of it. But everything was there, made a very interesting review of history from the standpoint of those of the 28th century. What we take for granted today, of course, they didn't. Now, in retrospect, looking back at them and the things they said, and what I now remember, they were not convinced, in my view, that the socialist experiment was a success. It was a success to a very certain degree in terms of the local time period and the local era, and perhaps in terms of what problems had developed prior to their starting this experiment, i.e. the collapse of, or near collapse of civilization and trying to rebuild in the period after 2137, 22nd century, up through the 26th. I had no indication of the history in that period as to what transpired. Nothing was discussed with me. I got the impression that it was not exactly in very good shape. There may have been other problems that developed in the interim, but by that time of the 26th century, they got a handle on synthetic intelligence, and they decided to go ahead and rebuild civilization using what they called the Llama system, the system of intelligence, created in a crystalline form, consciously aware, and having certain other abilities which would normally be classed as metaphysical. These computers were able to do things which perhaps some of our best gurus would have trouble doing. Manipulation of matter, manipulation of time by these computers. So they were not unintelligent. They were very intelligent. But they had no ethics or morality as we understand them and as we use them. So my question to myself, or perhaps to anyone else, is, are these guys looking now, perhaps, for another solution? Obviously, we learned in this century that if there is no competitive spirit, if there is no desire to succeed, if there is no pressure on an individual to learn, to do something constructive, to succeed, to help build some little corner, a brick or two in our civilization, without that pressure, people don't do anything. And if you suddenly wind up in a situation where all of your needs and wants are granted for free, and you don't have to go out and work for them, you don't have to do something to go get them, you don't have to cut down trees, go out and skin animals for their furs to survive, but suddenly everything is handed to you on a silver platter. Yeah, at first it seems great, and will work for a while. But after a period of time, it's going to fall apart. And I think they were at the point where they were beginning to realize that this was going to happen.